Welcome back to the YouTube channel of the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we're delving deeper into the profound insights of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support means the world to us. We kindly ask you to like and share this audiobook, thus expanding its reach and allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you receive immediate notifications when new content is uploaded. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, cultivating a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner tranquility. We are sincerely grateful for your involvement in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. Let's now begin today's reading. Death Without Drama. March 2, 2018. There was a nice cartoon in the New Yorker recently. 3 hooded death figures with scythes, and one of them is lying dead on the ground. One of the other ones is saying to the third one, "You never think it's going to happen to you." Most of us go through life like that. And yet death happens to everybody. Most people don't like to think about it because they think there's nothing you can do about it. They're, you might say, fatalistic about fatality. You die, you just die, and that's it. But the Buddha realized that there's a skill to dying, because death is not the end. You can die well or die poorly, and how you manage your death is going to play a large role in what happens after death. This is one of the reasons why we practice, one of the reasons why we contemplate the 5 reflections so often. We're subject to aging, illness, death, and separation. These things are all inevitable. But then we have our karma. That's what makes a difference. Now, for most us our karma is that we want more, as in that other chant we did just now. The world is swept away, does not endure, offers no shelter, has nothing of its own, there's no one in charge, and yet, we're all slaves to craving. We want to keep coming back for more and more and more of being swept away. That's the problem. But we can learn how to gain some control over that craving at least, and at best, of course, put an end to it. Before we can put an end to it, though, we need to get some control over it. This is why we meditate, because there's a skill in gaining control over the mind. The Buddha talks about the things you have to watch out for as death comes. There are 2 big ones. One is worry. Your own worry about yourself, what you're facing, along with your worries about the people you're leaving behind. The other thing you have to watch out for is sensuality. Your attachment to planning for sensual pleasures, which leads to fear that you'll be deprived of the pleasures you've enjoyed. When we practice meditation, we're learning how not to fall for these attachments. Regard them simply as hindrances coming up in the mind. No matter how insistent they may seem that you really want a particular pleasure, that this is something you really have to worry about, you have to tell yourself you don't need those things. As for the best preparation for the future, it lies in gaining more discernment, more concentration, more mindfulness. You don't know the details of what's going to happen in the future, but you do know that when unexpected things come, the more mindful, alert, and discerning you are, then the more likely you'll be able to handle these things well. And the more you'll have the ability not to get knocked over by these events. One of our biggest problems is the narratives we tell ourselves. And the narrative of death is a very upsetting one. But we don't have to tell ourselves that narrative, or any other narrative. That's another thing the practice does as we're developing concentration. We start out by trying to be with just the body, feelings, and mind, in and of themselves, at the level before we turn them into issues, before we turn them into narratives. The in and of itself is there before we turn these things into the ordinary becomings of daily life. What you want to do with this body, what kind of feelings you want, how you're going to go about getting them, the attitudes that come up in the mind, the stories they tell. We try to get at our experience of the body, feelings, and mind before they've turned into becomings. When there's still just a potential for a becoming with narratives, we turn them into a becoming with concentration, which doesn't have narratives. If you were to be asked, what was the narrative of your concentration today? The answer would be, well, I watched this breath, then I watched that breath, and then I watched that breath. A pretty dull narrative. But the point is not in the narrative. You don't have to remember all the breaths you've watched. You just have to remember to be with each one as it comes, and try to breathe in a way that's skillful each time you breathe. Try to find whatever pleasure or potential for pleasure there can be in that breath. Give the mind something good to stay with, so that it's not hungering after any narratives. It's just the breath in and of itself, the body in and of itself, not the body in the world, where you might wonder about whether it's good looking or not, whether people will like it or not, whether it's strong enough to do this or that job. Stay with just the fact that you've got a body right here. That's it. It's just a body. Feelings are just feelings. Mind states are just mind states, without all the fearful narratives. And that's your refuge. The Buddha talks about taking the Dhamma as a refuge, and he explains it as establishing mindfulness in this way. It's your refuge because it helps pull you out of the narratives that would make things overwhelming. There's a lot of drama that can happen around death, but death can also be without drama. You have that choice, and that's the skill we're trying to develop. That's the other part of meditating. There's not much drama about sitting and watching your breath. Like that older New Yorker cartoon. A woman is talking to a friend. In the background, you see her husband in the next room, sitting and meditating. And she's complaining to her friend. Henry used to be such an interesting neurotic before he took up meditation. The meditation is much better for you than neurosis, but there's no drama. There are people who live for the drama, but then the drama can overwhelm them. I know an author who wrote a book about infidelity on a large scale, a man who was very unfaithful to a lot of women. But then she found that her husband was cheating on her, and she couldn't take it, so she committed suicide. It's one thing to like the drama just for the taste, as they say in Indian aesthetic theory, which describes how you're not actually experiencing what the characters are experiencing. You're just tasting their emotions at a distance, which makes them interesting and enjoyable. But then when things like that actually happen to you, the suffering can be immense and overwhelming. That's not what we want. We want to learn to keep the mind from being overwhelmed. The Buddha talks about feelings invading the mind and remaining. What he means is that the feelings overwhelm you. He trained himself so that he was not invaded by the feelings, and he was not overwhelmed. They didn't remain. A feeling would come and it would just slip away, like water off a duck's back. How do you do that? By developing this refuge of mindfulness. The Buddha has an image of the practice being like a fortress. You've got mindfulness as the gatekeeper, who tries to remember to recognize unskillful thoughts, and to keep them from coming into the fortress. Mindfulness has 3 functions altogether. 1 is remembering to stay alert in the present moment. 2 is recognizing what's coming up, learning to label things as skillful and unskillful. Rather than my narrative, this is an unskillful thought of this particular variety. And then 3, once you recognize what variety it is, then you know what to do with it. You remember how to deal with unskillful thoughts in an effective way, and how to effectively give rise to skillful qualities. That's what mindfulness does. It protects the fortress at the gate. But if it happens to let somebody in, then you've got the soldiers inside, which stand for right effort, armed with knowledge of the Dhamma. In other words, if something unskillful does come into the mind, you remember what the Dhamma has taught about things like that, and you do your best to get rid of it. Then you've got concentration, which is the food that keeps the soldiers and the gatekeeper strong. At the same time, the soldiers and the gatekeeper are protecting the stores of food. They don't want the food to get stolen. So these are the qualities that, working together, see you through. These are your protection. The fortress itself has a foundation post, which is conviction. The conviction is that your actions really will matter, which is why we're not fatalistic about fatality. When death comes, we know there is a skill to approaching it. The actions you've been developing, the skills you've been developing through your meditation, through your practice, will see you in good stead. As long as you have that conviction, you'll work at getting more skillful in your actions, even up to your last breath. Finally, discernment is the fortress wall. It's covered with plaster so that the enemy can't gain a foothold. The soldiers throw the enemy out and your discernment keeps them out. That's your refuge. But the key to all this is to get to things before they turn into the narratives of becoming that make events overwhelming. See that the body is just the body. This is what the body does. It's going to die inevitably. We have to prepare for that, so that when the time comes, we're not knocked out of line. The time has come? Okay, this is what you do when the time has come. You've been preparing for this. It's just body. It's just feelings. It's just mind states. That way, the mind can go on to whatever opportunities it has created for itself through its karma. If you do it well, then you go to a place where you have more opportunities to practice, which could be the human realm, or it could be the realm of the devas. Sometimes you hear that it's only in the human realm that people can practice the Dhamma, but that's not true. Devas can practice, too, when they're heedful. So, if any of those realms open up with an opportunity to practice and you're not able yet to completely let go, go there, and it still counts as a skillful death. So we're working on these skills. Seeing the hindrances as hindrances rather than as more interesting stories to follow, learning to develop our fortress inside with its gatekeeper, its soldiers, and its food. That way, even though we don't look for death, when it happens to come, we're ready for it. We can approach it with skill, realizing that our level of skill will make a huge difference. All three functions of mindfulness. March 3, 2018. Mindfulness means keeping something in mind, like we're doing right now. We're keeping the breath in mind. But why are we keeping the breath in mind? There are basically three functions for mindfulness on the path. One is to remember to stay alert to what you're doing in the present moment and not let your attention shift off to the past or the future. The second is to remember to recognize what's coming up in the present moment and specifically what you're doing, to see what's skillful, what's unskillful. If, say, a thought arises in the mind, you can label it simply as a thought. Or if it's a specific hindrance, you can remember, this is sensual desire, this is ill will or whatever. Noting just that much allows you to step out of the hindrance for a bit. That's when you apply the third function, which is to remember what's effective in getting rid of unskillful thoughts and developing skillful ones in their place. This passes the job on to ardency, or right effort, to actually do the work. So you remember to be alert. You remember to recognize what's going on so that you can then deal with it in terms of right effort. That last function, the function of right effort, often gets forgotten in discussions of mindfulness. Many years back there was a monk who went into the hills of Burma and asked a senior monk there, "Where in the canon does the Buddha teach vipassana?" And the other monk replied, "Well, isn't everything in the Satipatthana Sutta?" And that response that one sutta contains everything you need to know about vipassana or even about mindfulness has led to what's now the modern mindfulness movement, where the focus is totally on the first two functions of mindfulness. To be in the present moment and to recognize what's happening. But the sutta is not complete. It's not even a complete account of mindfulness. It gives the formula for mindfulness. That you keep track of the body in and of itself, ardent, alert and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. The same formula is repeated for feelings, for mind, and for mental qualities. But then the sutta addresses only one part of the formula. What does it mean to keep track of these things in and of themselves? It treats that part in a lot of detail, so much detail, and the sutta is so long, that people naturally assume it's complete. But the question of what ardency does the third function of mindfulness isn't explicitly addressed at all. Which gives the impression that you just stay in the present to note what's coming and going, and that should be enough. But it's not. Now, sometimes simply watching things come and go in the mind is enough to develop a sense of dispassion toward them, but it doesn't always work. And simply watching things coming and going is not enough to get the mind into concentration, which is what the purpose of mindfulness is. Even the Satipatthana Sutta itself mentions this. When you're focusing on the breath, you start out by just discerning when it's long, when it's short. Then you consciously try to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, breathe out. From there, you calm bodily fabrication, which, the canon tells us in another place, means getting the mind into the fourth jhana. That doesn't happen on its own. Similarly with feelings. The Sutta talks about feelings of the flesh, which are the feelings that arise willy-nilly at the senses. But then it also mentions feelings not of the flesh, which are things you have to consciously give rise to. Pain not of the flesh is the realization that there's work to be done and you haven't reached the goal yet. It's a painful thought, but the Buddha actually recommends developing it. Better than sitting around being upset at things in the world. He says to try to develop a desire to attain a goal and a willingness to put up with the pain of that desire, the pain that comes when you realize that you aren't there yet because that's your motivation to practice. Then there's pleasure not of the flesh, which is the sense of ease and well-being that comes when you get the mind into right concentration. So, even though the Sutta doesn't explicitly mention getting the mind into jhana, it implicitly ends up there, at levels of jhana, which need to be done and are not just going to happen on their own. After all, that's one of the functions of what the Buddha calls mindfulness as a governing principle. Remembering to give rise to anything skillful that's not there in the mind and then, once it's there, to maintain it so that it doesn't fall away. It's good to think about this third function of mindfulness, both because it's the one that tends to get forgotten and because it's the most important. There are times when you have to consciously try to get past, say, sensual desires or feelings of ill will, and the act of simply noticing that they're there won't be enough to get rid of them. This is where the Buddha's analysis of how you deal with things that are taking over the mind comes in. There are 5 steps. The first is to look for the origination. What causes that state to come? What sparks it? Be aware as soon as something has been sparked in the mind. Don't wait until it becomes full-blown. The second step is to notice when it passes away. A lot of these thoughts come and go, come and go, come and go. When they come, they stir up some hormones. Then the thoughts are gone, but the hormones are still stirred up. You're still having the physical symptoms, say, of lust or of anger or fear or guilt. And because the physical symptoms are there, you figure, well, the emotion must still be there, the thought must still be there, and so you can dig up the thought again. So it's good to notice when the thought goes. Realize that it comes and goes in short periods, then it'll stop for a while, and then it will start up again. Look for the times when you're starting it up again. That way, it begins to seem less monolithic, and you also begin to realize where you go for it, what sparks it. Because that relates to the third step, which is to look for the allure. What you find attractive in the emotion, even if it's negative. Say when sensual desire arises, a desire for a particular kind of food, you ask yourself, why am I going for it? What's the pull? In some cases, it's because the body actually needs that kind of food. In other cases, it has to do with the associations we have around food. They talk about comfort food. I've never found meatloaf to be particularly comforting, but there are associations you have with things like that. Your mother made it back when you were young, and so there are associations that go with that. There are other kinds of food where the associations have more to do with status or something exotic. This is why we have that reflection on why we eat. Just for the maintenance of the body, to make sure that we don't get ill, and that we have the strength to practice. That's all we need. Food doesn't have to be fancier than that. So look for the allure. Sometimes it actually makes sense, and in that case, it's not really a defilement. But other times, it's something pretty strange and we tend to hide it from ourselves. We don't see it or we're embarrassed about it. Part of the mind is embarrassed, so it hides it from the rest of the mind. All too often we don't know exactly why we go for something. This can apply not only to sensual desire, but also to ill will or to worries about things. Sometimes you worry about things because it feels righteous. You feel responsible because you're worrying. But the worrying doesn't really accomplish much and actually depletes your energy to deal with the unexpected. This becomes particularly clear at death. One of the things the Buddha recommends, if someone is dying, is to make sure they're not worried about the people they're leaving behind. After all, at that point there's really nothing they can do for those other people. The worrying just drags them down. But sometimes there's a sense of obligation. People you're responsible for. You feel, how can I leave these people? Well, we've been leaving one another for who knows how long. This is where the master narrative of Buddhism is useful. The narrative of many, many lifetimes. Put the narrative of your life in the context of that larger master narrative and see how it looks from that perspective. People have had lives intertwined who knows how many times, and then they've separated again and again. They come back again, get separated again. And the roles get switched. If you identify too strongly with a particular role, you're going to suffer when you no longer can play that role. So look for the allure, and then look at it in terms of that master narrative. Is going for this particular defilement really worth it in terms of its consequences? Does it make sense in terms of that larger narrative? This is when you get to the fourth step, which is to see the drawbacks. Holding on to that particular kind of thought. Where does it lead you? Where does it go? And what does it make you do to other people? So much of our desire for happiness requires laying claim to things. And, of course, other people are going to have to lay claim to some of the same things. When everything is laid claim to, where are you going to find an innocent happiness? You've got to push other people out of the way, as in that vision the Buddha had of the fish in the stream, pushing one another out of the way to get that last gulp of water before they all die. Even the ones who get the gulp of water die anyhow, and because they harm one another, there's karma that goes with that. That's the way it is in the world. And it's not just fish. This is the way human beings live. So, when a thought comes up to the mind and pulls you away from the practice, pulls you away from concentration, you can tell yourself, do I want to be like a fish, laying claim to something that I can't even hold on to for very long, or can I come back inside and find some well-being there, in my sense of the body as I feel it from within, my sense of my mind, as I sense it from within. Because that's something that nobody else can lay claim to. Nobody else can even know it. That's your territory entirely. When you can think in these ways, you get to the fifth step. A sense of dispassion that frees you because you realize there's something better that comes when you let go. That's an important principle in the Buddhist teachings. You don't let go simply by saying that everything is really bad, so I might as well not try. There is something good in life. There's a whole area inside your body, inside your awareness that you can straighten out, and in straightening it out you can find a genuine happiness. That's why we let go. We let go out of dispassion, and the dispassion comes from growing up. This is a lot of what our growth in the practice is. We're growing up. We're maturing. We admit the consequences of our actions, and then we try to find a way to make our actions less harmful to others and less harmful to ourselves. We realize that we can take responsibility for ourselves. It's in these ways that mindfulness performs that third function, which is helping us remember how to let go of things that are harmful, how to develop things that are skillful. You remember this from things you've heard and also, even more vividly, from things you've done that have given good results. So in your practice of mindfulness, make sure that it's complete. Remember to stay in the present moment anchored in one of the four frames of reference. Remember to recognize things that are coming up in the mind and learn how to label them as this is skillful or this is unskillful. That's usually not the first thought that comes to us, of course. Lust comes into the mind, anger comes into the mind, and we just tend to go for it. We don't stop to label it as skillful or unskillful at all. The labels tend to be more, I like it. Let's go. But if you can stop for a bit and say, hey, this is a hindrance that enables you to move on to the third function, which is to remind yourself, this is what you do with a hindrance. You learn how to let it go. If there's something that leads to concentration or mindfulness, a sense of fullness and ease inside, you remember to develop that, and you remember how. In that way, the Buddha's teachings on mindfulness achieve their purpose, which is to give the mind a good place to dwell inside. A place where you settle down with a sense of well-being that doesn't have to depend on anybody else, and puts the mind in a good position where it can see even more clearly where its attachments are, and how it can let them go. So, it's good that people are trying to be alert to the present moment, and trying to recognize what's going on, But it's even better when they move on to the third step and learn how to use that knowledge, use that awareness to find something really skillful inside. That's how the Buddha characterized his own quest. The quest for what was skillful. This is what he found, that from the concentration he could develop in the mind in a way that leads to a happiness that goes even deeper, that goes beyond the concentration. So, check inside yourself. Develop the qualities that the Buddha talked about. See if they lead to the same result. Anupassana. April 18, 2018. Tell yourself that the breath is your friend, and you're going to stay with your friend. You're going to be loyal. You're going to be consistent. You're going to be a true friend to the breath, and that way, the breath gets friendlier. But the important thing is that you stay together. There's a Pali term anupassana, which literally means to follow and to watch. You can translate it as keeping track. It's how you stay together. It's a term used both for concentration and for insight practice. When you're doing mindfulness practice, trying to get the mind to settle down with the breath and stay with the breath so as to get into concentration, that's called anupassana. You're keeping track of the breath. It's like keeping track of a thread going through a carpet. There are lots of other threads in the carpet, but you're not going to get interested in them, or if you're going to be interested in them, it's simply in terms of how they relate to the thread you're following. So think of the breath as a thread that you follow through time. To be on good terms with it, Ajahn Lee gives advice for how to work with the breath energy in the body. The Buddha simply says to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, the whole body as you breathe out, and to calm bodily fabrication. He also talks about developing a sense of pleasure, a sense of rapture even, as the mind settles down, and then letting that pleasure and rapture spread to fill the whole body. He doesn't say how, but working with the breath is a good way of 1. Being aware of the whole body, and 2. Calming the breath, and then 3. Letting that sense of ease spread throughout the whole body, all at the same time. You're trying to get to a state where the breath fills the body, your awareness fills the body, a sense of ease fills the body. All these things come together. The breath here, of course, means breath energy. It's one of the 4 elements: earth, water, wind, fire. We can sometimes take a while to get on good terms with it because we can easily mistake it for the water element. The breath flows through the body, but so does the blood. We can confuse the two. We can push the blood around. In fact, we do that an awful lot as we go through our lives. If you've had a lot of repressed emotions, you've been pushing the blood around quite a bit. Or if the body's not well, sometimes the blood is flowing in the wrong spots or the wrong directions and stagnating in other spots, so when you feel that something's not quite right, you try to push it around. As for the breath, it flows, but it's not something you can push. Its nature is already to flow through everything, no matter how solid, but if you push it, you're pushing the blood, which can't flow through solids, and sometimes that can give you headaches. It can get you all discombobulated. It's important that you understand exactly what you're following. You're following the sense of energy. And to let it flow, the word let is important. It's like opening valves on water pipes. When you open the valve, you don't have to push the water through. Just open the valve, and the water will do the flowing on its own. In the same way, wherever there's a sense of tension anywhere in the body, you want to relax that tension. It's like opening a valve to allow the breath to flow through. So just think of releasing, and that's pretty much all you have to do. In fact, as the mind begins to settle down, you'll begin to realize that the perception you hold in mind is what's going to make all the difference, what's going to allow you to relax to begin with, to keep you relaxed, and to allow the breath to flow smoothly throughout the body. If the flow seems to be working at cross purposes, in other words, it's flowing in one direction in one part and an opposite direction in another part, and they're clashing, just hold in mind the question: how could they work together? And sometimes the breath will just sort itself out. All you have to do is allow. Then, as the sense of well-being spreads, you can let your awareness spread into the body, too. For concentration to work, for mindfulness to work, this process of anupassana keeping track works best if everything is on good terms. You're trying to get the mind anchored in the body with the breath, and you follow the breath regardless of whatever else comes up. Sometimes visions come. Sometimes sounds come. And all too often we think, here's a sign that something important is happening. But you should try to stay with the breath because the breath is meaningless. Don't go jumping for meanings. We had a visitor here recently who was trying to gauge what level of concentration he was on and where he had advanced in terms of his insight, but these things don't come with signs. Whatever signs there are could easily be coming from ignorance. Your main task is to anupassana, to follow and watch this one thing and be on good terms with it. You're doing this with something meaningless because it allows you to question the meanings you give to things. When a sign comes up or a vision comes up and the mind says, this must mean this or this must mean that, put a question mark next to that comment. One of the easiest ways for meditation to pull you astray is if you start giving meanings to things and believing the meanings. Either when a vision comes or when an insight comes, you say, oh, this must be a sign of X or a sign that I've reached this level or that level. That's how people go astray. Upasika Key has a good piece of advice. She says that whenever an insight comes, look at what immediately follows the insight in the mind. Sometimes you see a little bit of greed, a little bit of aversion, and you realize, okay, the insight has been tainted. You've latched onto it. Ajahn Lee's method for dealing with insights as they come like this is to ask yourself, to what extent is it true and to what extent is it false? To what extent is the opposite true? So you put a question mark next to these things. The important thing is that you begin to see these processes of the mind as it gives meanings to things and then rides with them. You see that it can cause you an awful lot of trouble that way. This is where the anupassana turns from concentration into insight. The difference between concentration and insight is basically the questions you're asking. With concentration, the right question is, how do I get the mind to settle down? How do I get to enjoy the object? How do I get to be continually with the object, become one with the object? And then you follow it. With insight, the questions are, how is this a fabrication? And what's the best way to deal with these fabrications? The Buddha's instructions on breath are divided into 4 tetrads, 4 sets of 4 steps. In each tetrad, the processes are the same. One tetrad deals with the breath, one tetrad with feelings, another with mind, another with dhammas. In other words, the 4 frames of reference in the establishing of mindfulness. In each case, you get sensitive to the fact that that particular thing is being fabricated, and then you play with it to heighten that sense. Oh yes, this really is something that I'm putting together right now. You want to see this because your experiences are composed of 2 things. One is the results of karma coming in from the past, and the other is both what you're doing right now and the results of what you're doing right now. In fact, what you're doing right now is what enables you to experience the raw material coming in from the past to begin with. When the Buddha explains dependent co-arising, this fabrication in the present moment actually comes prior to your awareness of the results of past actions, and the Buddha wants you to see that. You don't have much control over the results of past actions, but you do have control over what you're doing right now, and you want to see, what am I doing right now that's causing suffering? Can I fabricate things in a way that causes less suffering? With the breath, you can see that it is a kind of fabrication. The way you breathe sometimes goes totally on automatic pilot, but there is an intentional element, and all too often that automatic pilot disguises some underlying intentions you don't notice. So you try to bring them up into consciousness. Ask yourself, I'm deciding when to breathe in, when to breathe out, so how can I do that well? How can I find a sense of ease and well-being through the breath? And then how can I calm the effect of the breath on the mind? The same pattern applies to feelings. Feelings are a part of what they call mental fabrication. They go together with perceptions. Perceptions are the images you hold in mind, and here we're interested in the perceptions you use to keep the mind with the breath, but also the perceptions that you use to deal with any obstructions that come up, any hindrances that come up. With hindrances, the number one thing is to perceive, say, sensual desire and ill will as hindrances, and not as your friends. Perceive anything that pulls you away from the breath right now as a hindrance, and then learn to perceive it as something that you really want to get past. Those are two different perceptions. Sometimes you can perceive something as a hindrance, but another part of the mind says, I don't care. I like it. You need to have other perceptions to help you see that that's not anywhere you really want to go. You can think about the drawbacks of the hindrance. If you thought about it for 24 hours, where would it take you? Well, not anywhere good. So why give it any time at all? But more important are the perceptions that allow you to stay with the breath. You'll find that different perceptions will have a different effect on the breath and a different effect on the mind, so use the perceptions first that give rise to a sense of well-being, pleasure, rapture in the breath. Then use the perceptions that calm the sense of rapture down, that give rise more to a state of equanimity, so you can see to what extent you really are fabricating things right now. Those are the fabrications you want to gain insight into. Which are the ones you want to hold on to? Which ones are the ones you don't want to hold on to? i.e., which are the ones you want to keep doing? Which ones are habits you want to stop? This is where we bring in some more perceptions, the perceptions of inconstancy, stress, not self, and doing that, too, is a kind of anupassana, inside anupassana. As you apply a perception, say, to the breath or to the mind as being something inconstant or fabricated, again you're keeping track of something. You're keeping track of its inconstancy or its stress or the fact that you have no control over it. You may have some control over it. If you didn't have any control over these things, you wouldn't be able to meditate, you wouldn't be able to practice, but there's an extent to which when you try to control things, you run up against a wall. You want to see that and ask yourself, to what extent can I find true happiness with this? To what extent can I hold on to this and depend on it? When you see that it's not dependable or worth holding on to, that's when you let it go. As long as it is worth holding on to as you're working on your path, you don't let it go quite yet. But when the path is fully developed, that's when you let go of everything. You see that everything is not worth holding on to. It's a value judgment, and there's no technique that can convince you of the value of letting go until you see for yourself that you go for a particular way of fabricating things in your mind, fabricating your experience, because there's an allure. You have to ask yourself, what is it that I'm trying to get out of this? Especially when it's something like greed, aversion, or delusion. Why do you like it even though part of you knows it's wrong? Then you compare the allure with the drawbacks, but as long as you don't quite see what the real allure is, why you're really going for it, then no matter how much you tell yourself to let go, it's like trying to shake tar off of your hand. It's going to stick. So you have to be very still. This is why concentration and discernment have to go together. Be very still to watch when the mind goes for something. Why does it go? What does it think it's getting out of it? The reasons are going to differ from person to person. This is why the Buddha didn't teach a technique for vipassana. Instead, he recommended asking questions like, to what extent is this fabrication? To what extent can I trust it? To what extent do I realize that it's an activity I don't want to engage in anymore? Those are some of the questions you ask as you anupassana, as you follow the thread of inconstancy, as you follow the thread of stress or the thread of not self, until the mind learns how to be perfectly fine with letting go. If you try to let go of things when you don't have the concentration, the mind feels lost. It thrashes around. Which is one of the reasons why the Buddha said to keep track of the breath, as you're keeping track of these other things at the same time. You don't leave the breath. It's just that the questions you ask get more sophisticated, more subtle. Ajahn Lee's image is of cutting down a forest. That's concentration. Inside is burning all the logs. It's the same forest, just that what you do with it gets more subtle and gets more effective, gets more thorough in clearing away stress from the mind. Even just concentration can get rid of a lot of stress, but insight gets rid of more. And both are centered on this process of anupassana, keeping track, following the thread of the breath, following the thread of the mind's fabrications, seeing when they're worth holding on to, and when they're not. That's why it's all one practice. The questions develop, and the results will develop, too. So stick with your friend. The breath is the friend that enables all of this to happen. Try to get on good terms with it. As for the things that come up aside from that, remember that you're sticking with this one thread, and you don't want the other threads to distract you or pull you away. Seeing danger in birth. October 30, 2019. I remember the first time when being a human being scared me. I was about 6 years old when I met a man who had had a stroke and was half paralyzed. I was told that he hadn't always been that way. He had been normal, and then all of a sudden half his body became useless. I remember this sense of horror, not so much at the man himself, but that it could happen to me. Ajahn Lee and Upasika Key talk about this same sort of thing. In Upasika Key's case, it was when one of her younger siblings was born. She saw all of the pain her mother went through during childbirth, and she had to leave home for 3 days. The same with Ajahn Lee. As a child, he saw all the pain that the women in his village went through as they were giving birth, and he had to run away. It's good to reflect on these things. Here we are in a human birth, and it's not a very secure place to be. We have to find a way out if we want to find any real security or happiness. This is why we meditate, because we believe in the power of the mind to find a happiness that's more than ordinary. Try to use these thoughts, not to get you discouraged, but to encourage you to practice. That's the use of heedfulness. That's the use of recollection of death. This can happen to us all. If we can recollect death in a way that makes us heedful, that's an auspicious thing. In Thailand, there's a textbook they use for the Dhamma exams for lay people. It divides ceremonies into 2 sorts. Those that are auspicious and those that are inauspicious. The inauspicious ones all have to do with death. But the idea that anything associated with death is inauspicious is not a Buddhist idea. It's more Brahmanical. The Buddhist attitude is that if you can reflect on death in a way that makes you heedful, then it becomes auspicious. When you see a dead person, the Buddha encourages you to be heedful by telling yourself, this body too. Such is its nature, such its unavoidable fate. But you don't have to see a dead body to reflect in this way. You can just think about the fact that there's death and reflect on your own death, too. We read about death every day in the news. The numbers vary, but a day doesn't go by without somebody dying. In fact, quite a few people die. They say that on average it's 200,000 people a day. So it's all around us, which means that we should be very heedful. Heedful in our virtue, heedful in our concentration, heedful in our discernment. Heedful in virtue means realizing that whatever we might gain by even the slightest infraction of the precepts isn't worth it. Those little gains get washed away, and then you're left with the karma. Heedful in your concentration means trying to be as careful as possible in your efforts to get the mind to settle down. Being alert, mindful, ardent, not just getting the mind to be still, but also watching the mind as it settles down. This way you can begin to understand when the mind does leave the topic of concentration, even if just for a moment. How does it do that? And why? Here you are. You've made the intention to stay with the breath, you work with the breath, get familiar with the breath, try to make the breath comfortable, so that it's a good place to stay, and yet the mind will still wander off. Why is that? How does it do that? What are the stages? There are psychologists who say they've studied brain patterns, and they can tell that when a person's made a decision, often the decision has been made a little bit before the person's aware of it. Their conclusion is that we have no free will, that somehow the brain makes the decision, and then we lie to ourselves that we've made the decision ourselves. But another kind of lying is going on. You were there when the decision was made, but then the mind likes to cover things up from itself. Part of it knows the decision was made to go, and it's just waiting for the opportunity to slip away. Can you catch it? Can you catch that little moment in the mind where it makes the decision, and then pretends that it didn't? It's like a dog we used to have at Wat Dhammasathat. It was a very clever dog. It would come up in the evening when the monks were having their evening allowables and would scratch your leg. If you looked down at it, it would look away and pretend that it hadn't done anything. Then if you ignored it, it would scratch your leg again. There are layers like that to the mind. And the purpose of concentration is to begin to see through those layers. That's what it means to be heedful in your concentration. Heedful in your discernment means that when an insight comes, you can't just accept it at face value. You've seen so many cases of people who have come to false conclusions that they're awakened, so you have to learn from other people's mistakes. You've got to watch yourself. When an insight arises, how does the mind respond? What's its immediate reaction? Ajahn Lee gives two pieces of advice. One is that when you gain an insight, you ask yourself, to what extent is the opposite true? As the Buddha pointed out, there are many things that are true but not necessarily beneficial. And this may not be the right time and place for them. So check whether or when and where the insight might be beneficial, whether it's the right time or place to apply it. Then ask yourself further, to what extent is the opposite of that insight true? The second piece of advice, he says, is that wherever there's true, there's going to be falseness as its shadow. Once you place a stamp on something as 100% true, something false has already slipped in. So you have to be careful about your insights. After all, if you're not careful, they're not going to be safe. They're going to lead you to do and say and think things that might be dangerous. You want to be careful all around. This is a quality that many of Ajahn Mun's students said they noticed in him. They'd set their minds on doing something and thought they were 100% right, and he would still find something wrong, an angle from which they hadn't looked, an angle they hadn't considered. Or you think about the Buddha. They called him the all-around eye. He saw things from every angle. That's how he was able to make himself 100% safe. So you want to see the dangers in birth, the dangers in becoming. Be alive to those dangers but don't be overwhelmed by them. The whole point of heedfulness is not that you give up in the face of dangers. In fact, it's the opposite of giving up in the face of dangers. The other part of heedfulness is seeing that there is an escape, and it can be accomplished through your actions. We take on right view, but remember that it is a view. It's not yet right knowledge. There are a lot of aspects of right view that the Buddha can't prove to you ahead of time. But he does offer two ways of conducting a pragmatic proof. For example, when you adopt as a working hypothesis the view that you do have the power of choice, that the results of your actions are going to depend on the intention behind the action, and that these results can last not only through this lifetime, but also to future lifetimes. The first test is that, if you adopt this view, you're more likely to behave in a skillful way than if you adopted its opposite. If you believed that you had no choice or that your choices didn't matter, you would just go with whatever came into the mind. The second proof is, if you believe in the possibility that there is a path that leads to awakening, to the end of becoming, you open more possibilities for what you might achieve in terms of a real happiness than if you assumed that there was no such thing as awakening or the end of becoming. At the very least, if you open yourself to the possibility, you might be able to make it happen. If you close your mind to the possibility, there's no way it's going to happen. In a way, adopting right view is a gamble. But you look around. There are really no other good alternatives, no inspiring alternatives, no noble alternatives. So you might as well give it a serious try. That's how you're heedful in your discernment. And it's through heedfulness that you provide yourself with safety. As the Buddha said, all skillful qualities are rooted in heedfulness. We're not skillful because we're innately good. At the same time, we're not innately bad. But our actions depend on a calculation. Is it going to be worth the effort? The more you believe in your power of action, and the more you notice the dangers that come from acting unskillfully, then the more your calculations will lead you to stay on the path. In harmony with the teachings of the Buddha, we emphasize the profound importance of sharing wisdom far and wide. Presently, we've made this extensive 1,000-page work accessible through audio format. The responsibility to further this noble cause now rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the broad dissemination of these teachings, which can benefit numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.